but good morning, everyone. Really pleased to have you join us today. My name is Tammy McLeod, if I haven't met you before, and I have the privilege of being the president and CEO of the Flinn Foundation. One of our important pillars in our work at Flinn is that of arts and culture, and we really try to do that on a statewide basis. And so today we're bringing you, I believe, a very special webinar called Windfall Funding and Capitalization that will be conducted by Susan Nelson, the Executive Vice President of TDC. TDC has been a very important partner of the Flinn Foundation in our arts and culture for several years now. And I believe that the timing is really perfect. We first conceptualized of this webinar due to some of the funding that was coming into arts and culture from the shuttered venues and other areas. And then most recently, with the generous contributions of our fellow foundation, the Piper Foundation, we saw this as an increasing need to talk about when we do have ample funding coming in and the best way to look at that going forward in a sustainable fashion. So I'll welcome everyone today and turn this over to Susan.
Good morning. Good morning. I hope everybody is doing well. Early this morning, I was saying to Tammy and Julie when we started, it's noon here in Boston, so we're up and revved, but I know it's 9 o'clock out there. So welcome and thank you for coming so early. We appreciate it. As Tammy said, we're going to talk a little bit about windfall funding and capitalization. We're going to talk a little bit about the lessons we've been learning out in the field and things we want to share with you. Let me talk for a few minutes before we start about how we want to interact with each other today. We're going to try to do something that we know is a little hard on Zoom, but what we really would like to make sure is that people can ask questions and make comments. So along the way, if you have a question that occurs to you or that is either clarifying or something you want a little more information about, like you don't understand on the slide, you don't understand what is happening, put it in the chat and we will monitor the chat and we will stop and answer the question. We will also stop at many points along the way just to say, do you have any questions? At that point, just unmute yourself and ask the question. I don't think there's going to be like a rollicking 50 people trying to talk at once. So I'm not really worried about that. So if you just, and if we do, then we'll do some other order. But literally, if I ask if there's any questions, please ask if there's any questions. So that's how we're going to do it. Does that make sense for everybody? Great. So Julie, do we think everybody's admitted?
Yes, everyone is as of now.
Wonderful. So here's our agenda for today. And I'm just going to stop and ask, everybody can see the screen? Everybody's good? Yes. And the other, one last piece. Julie sent you early this morning a hyperlink to this presentation. So along the way, if you want to look at that presentation yourself, you want to remind yourself what the information is, we sent it to you in advance so you could look at it yourself or manipulate it yourself. And so I will not be insulted if you're looking down and not looking at me. It's all fine. In fact, I'll only be able to see a few of you at a time, so I won't even know. So it's great. All right. So you do have that. And if you don't, let us know. But I think it's sometimes helpful to look. All right. So we're going to do this session in two parts. First, we're going to do lessons from the field. TDC has been engaged across the country, and we'll talk a little bit more about these actual studies that we've been doing, but we've been following over 385 organizations, arts and culture organizations, as they respond to the pandemic, and we've learned a lot. And so we're going to share some of those lessons as we start. And then we're going to actually go into capitalization and emerging from the crisis and what to really think about as you look at this Windfield funding. So 2 parts today. So let's start with the bigger picture, lessons from the field. The pandemic has led us to an influx of what we call windfall capital. And as Tammy said, we've been talking about this for a long time, what that means. And windfall capital is things that we just don't normally get, right? So for many of you, that's the PPP, or it could be tax credits, employee tax credits. It could be the SVOG, Save Our Venues, if you have a venue. There's been lots of other federal, state, and municipal funding that people have accessed and looked at. We have seen one-time gifts from foundations and individuals that don't look anything like we thought before. I know many of us walked into the pandemic pretty sure that arts and culture organizations were going to get short shift during the pandemic, and that did not happen. In fact, the opposite happened. Many funders stepped up and gave more money. And then something happened that many folks had hoped for but never seen before, that previously restricted multi-year gifts got unrestricted. So project grants became operating grants for many people. So there's been a lot of different types of money in the system that we have never seen before, and might never see, unfortunately, again. So what does that really mean for the sector? Well, we have to think about what type of money this is. Windfall capital is not truly operating money in the way we really think about it in the long term. It's much more about short-term money. It's been sparked by these extraordinary circumstances. It's one time and often, as I just said, non-repeatable. What we know also is that windfall funding cannot fix a broken business model. It can help you in many different ways. It can help you change your business model, perhaps. It can give you bridge capital until you can get to the right size again. It can repair your balance sheet, which in ways that might have taken you years before. It can mitigate operating risk during the pandemic and right shortly thereafter if you use it correctly, and perhaps it could fund some investments. So organizations need to carefully consider how to best use windfalls to support their organizational needs. So I will also stop and say that one of the things that we've come to understand about windfall funding in the arts and culture sector is that at the beginning of the pandemic, I believe many of us thought, and many of you probably when you couldn't sleep at night thought, how many organizations are really going to make it out on the other side? And we really worried that many wouldn't, but that has not happened. Windfall funding has stabilized the sector in a way that most folks will emerge one way or another from the pandemic. And so the doom and gloom that we saw in the beginning is not really what we're seeing on the other side, but it doesn't mean that things don't need to be really carefully thought through about how this money works and what this money works, how we can apply this money in good ways. So let's talk a little bit about how we've actually seen that play out in real time. So as I said in the beginning, we are part of this study. We are running the study called the Arts and Creativity Field Scan. Big name that sounds like nothing, but it's longitudinal research about the effects of COVID and the racial justice uprisings in arts and culture nonprofits. It's a population of foundation funding cohorts. So it's 11 foundations who actually have been funding, and they're folks that they've been funding over the last several years. We did 2 surveys in the spring of 20 and 21, and we did interviews in the fall and the very late spring, early summer of 21. As I said, it was 385 organizations across the country, all types, museums, performing arts organizations, art ed organizations, presenting, producing, exhibiting, every kind of organization you can think of, small, large, mega small. So we asked them folks these kind of questions. What are the current projected crisis impacts on your organization and the system you sit in? How have you responded and why? And how your answers changed from the beginning of the time we talked to you until the end of the time we talked about you. So as your thinking changed over time. So here's what we learned from talking to all these different folks. Strategic priorities in the field have changed. Number one thing that we learned is confronting racism, both programmatically and organizationally, has become much more central for white-led organizations. Many organizations that we talked to, in fact, the vast majority said that kind of thinking through how they were going to respond to social justice and racial uprisings had become critical to their strategy. And they were thinking about it not only just from the program side, which many people had thought about that before, but how could they change internally. But there was a worry that they'd spent the last year really thinking about that. And as they were getting to emerge from the pandemic, when they were having to go back to doing a lot of the work that they were meant to do, exhibiting, teaching, presenting, producing, that they wouldn't have the time to continue the work. So it was much on everybody's mind, and it was a huge worry about how they would continue to do the work. Equally on people's minds was this idea of digital strategies. So almost every organization we talked to had employed a digital strategy, but the results had been very mixed. Many organizations were seeing, after an uptick, we're seeing decline in participation. Many organizations wanted to continue with some kind of hybrid model, but there were others who weren't going to move it forward at all with digital programming. And no organization we talked to out of all of them were permanently replacing any kind of in-person programming with digital. So digital was a conundrum to many as we talked to them, how they were going to best move forward. We literally had a handful of organizations who had had a flat out success. But everybody else was really struggling with what does it mean to go digital. Biggest lesson about strategy, though, was most of the organizations talked to us about how they've been able to manage change reactively, and that they really felt that the biggest lesson of the pandemic was they had become more resilient and more adaptable. And they really wanted to hold on to that kind of resiliency and adaptability, and they wanted to think long and hard about how that worked. And what they did during this time that allowed them to be that way. And in some cases, most folks said it was some combination of a different kind of management structure, a different relationship with their board that was more flexible and more thoughtful, and their access to unrestricted dollars. That because a lot of the cash that they had that we just talked about, all the windfall money was unrestricted, they were able to make much more nimble changes and not think about how much money they had to put toward this program or that program. They were able to move quickly and reapply their money quickly. We also learned that cash flow cycles have changed for many organizations in ways that people wonder if it's permanent. So significant infusions of the money, as we talked about, combined with budget cuts for most organizations resulted in break even or better for FY20 and 21. And in fact, in 21, most folks talked about posting surpluses and significant surpluses. A few folks relied on reserved or increased endowments to achieve these incomes, but most folks really got to surpluses. And that some of the money in the windfall area came too late for organizations to fully plan around it for FY22. So they were really thinking hard about what that SVOG money, and I know if you are part of the Save Our Venues grant program, which I know a few of you on this call are, we all know it took a long time and it was very confusing. But here's the piece that we also heard, that uncertainty remains for 22 and 23. Public health rules keep changing, audience demand is unclear. Rehiring staff is proving to be a serious challenge for many organizations. A lot of furlough staff have moved on, and new hires are asking for much higher salaries. We're also hearing that recreating culture is difficult. Replacing the influx of unrestricted, all this windfall money feels daunting. Digital strategy testing will require an investment of time and money. And all the investments around DEI work will also require time and money. So navigating the exit from the pandemic will require a lot of, here's a technical word, planfulness. A lot of how are we going to think it through in a different and interesting way. So before I move forward, any questions about what we've been learning in the field? Anything where you think, I'd like to know more about that, or that doesn't make any sense, or any questions? Nope. Okay. So how does the effective capitalization address these findings? So access to consumable cash during the pandemic allowed most organizations to be more resilient and adaptable as we move forward. I will tell you, as we are reporting out to the 11 foundations around the country who funded this work, that has been our #1 finding. Operating dollars, flexible capital made organizations resilient and adaptable. So as you think about investing going forward, you should really think about that. And we are actually also presenting that finding to many donors around the country. This idea of how can we get more flexible consumable capital in the system is really an important piece to hold on to out of the pandemic. And the challenges of exiting the pandemic create a real need for this flexible capital because we just don't know. This is one of the few times in life where we can't kind of look at a trend line and say, geez, we kind of know this about ourselves and we can kind of make our best guess. We really don't know how we're coming out. We don't know. We have good guesses, but we got nothing to look at to say, well, it could look like this or that. So exiting the pandemic creates an opportunity to take a new or a fresh approach to capitalization, emphasizing the unrestricted capital already on balance sheets and increasing an unrestricted support. So how do we ensure that we are asking funders and supporters for the most effective type of support moving forward? And so capitalization is, thinking a lot about how do you ask people to invest and give to you, as well as what you actually make decisions about in your own business model. So how are we really thinking about making sure we're getting the most effective type of support? So that's a little bit about the field and where we are before we jump into the case study. One again is DEI, diversity, equity, and inclusion. Shorthand, bad shorthand, but that's what it is. All the work around equity, anti-racism, inclusion, and diversity. Okay.
Susan, Samantha Turner here. I have a question.
Hi, Samantha.
For you.
Yeah.
Hi. The funders have been fantastic, as you pointed out here, with unrestricting funds and letting us use them as they needed to be used during this time. What are you hearing from funders about how they might move forward as we, at some point, are in the recovery and beyond recovery? Are there lessons learned from funders about the ability for organizations to appropriately apply funds without restriction? Or is there still that concern that organizations need to be managed with how gifts are provided?
Yep. So I think Samantha, a little bit of both. I think, the conversation that we've been having with many funders, and we've been invited to present our findings around this to many different funders. We just did a group of 50, I think is happening in real time. So people are seeing the lessons, they're getting the reports back on how people have been using their unrestricted money. That's been very helpful to them. They've been engaged in new cycles of grant making. That's been really helpful to them. This information there's another study out too that has been looking at capital and individual artists and how if it's given freely, it does the same thing. I think this conversation is live and real. And a lot of folks have been pleasantly surprised about how their unrestricted gifts were used and have felt good about it. But this is a shift and it's a real-time conversation.
Thank you.
Yep. Okay. All right, so let's talk about kind of the heart of the matter that we came here to talk about today. So we're going to look at questions you should ask to navigate the road ahead if you want to remain resilient and adaptable. So we want to start with the question if you've met me before, you will know that we always start with this question: how well capitalized are you? What level of uncertainty do you face? Do you have cash at the right time to get back on track, to move your organization forward? Are there things you need to invest in order to move forward? And for a few of you, not all of you, for those who are on the performing arts side, should you address deferred revenue, i.e. using subscription dollars before their time? So those are the questions that we want to move forward on and really think about. And the way we're going to do that is we're going to use what we call a synthesized case study based on a mid-sized performing arts organization called the All-Purpose Group, APG, to walk you through these questions. This case study is based on 3 organizations' choices about how they move together that we've synthesized together. At points during the session, we will conduct a poll to hear how you would address these questions if you were leading APG. So we're going to really do it as a case, tell you about the choices, tell you about the why, and then show you how people made the decision, and then ask you what you would have done. We really want to know that. I will tell you, for the organizations here who are not performing arts organizations, all the questions that we are looking at, with the exception of deferred revenue, have the same strategic impact in a museum as they would as in a performing arts group. So just, it's all about the risk on revenue, the risk on expenses, look at your balance sheet. It's all applicable right across the board. So I would ask you to suspend the performing arts part and just think about it as the bigger idea of revenue, balance sheet, expenses. Okay. All right. So let's talk about the all-purpose group as they came into FY22. Now you're seeing why I sent you this in advance. They are a group that started as a $6 million organization. They shrank down. They're hoping by FY23 to get a little bit back to where they were. Over time, their attendance trends have been flat or declining. They have tried different things, but the best they can do is flat, and sometimes they do declining. But for FY21, like many of their friends, they are in the big survey we talked about, this organization is projecting a surplus to end FY21 as it's going into FY22 of $600,000. And most of that's coming from the fact that they did indeed make cuts. As you can see, they're much smaller, but they also got PPP, and some generous donors stepped up, made the difference, and they're going to, again, post this surplus. They haven't had any in-person programming since March of 2020. They've done some stream performances. They got an initial take up, and then, like most folks, some declining participation. They were really lucky that most of their subscription dollars were forgiven or done in exchange for streaming. They have a little endowment, $4.5 million. They have a line of credit that they've taken out and used. And just like everybody else, as they come into 22 and think about getting more and more programming online, they're having a hard time staffing up. And when they do that, they're having higher salary demands. And that's a lot of the folks on the front lines that they're worried about, people taking tickets, cleaning the venues, doing the different pieces. They're having a hard time with that. So moving forward, what they're thinking about as they're entering into their FY22 budgeting, they have been doing equity and anti-racism work has begun, but the CEO is really worried because they're little still at $5.2 million, and the staff is not, they're having a hard time staffing, and the work that they've been able to do on this, which has been hard, they just think, oh, we're not going to have the capacity to move it forward. They are planning a slower return to in-person through FY22. They're they are doing the in-person things now, but they really want to think about this digital hybrid idea about how can we offer both in-person and digital offerings. They dropped their subscriptions late, so it's not the money they might get for advanced sales is not coming in the normal way they get for cash flow. Their FY22 budget really depends on that $600K surplus, because when they did all their numbers, they think I need that surplus to be applied to my FY22 budget, and making sure that they get the same level of gifts as 21. The CEO and the finance committee chair are worried that the $850K board designated reserve is not sufficient to get through a year of uncertainty. And they have this idea that eventually they might get SVOG. They think they could get 1.6. They're not sure. It's as they enter the FY22 budget year that the Save Our Venues grant could come their way. And they also have been in conversation with a brand new donor who has given them a little bit, but has had a great run up in the market and wants to do something, but doesn't know what that is. And so they don't want to count on it because I'm not sure what that means. So that's in the background, but it's not really there. So that's the all-purpose group. Any questions? Okay. So let's start with the questions that we said we were going to lay out. How well capitalized is APG? So before anybody does any budgeting at any time, anywhere, anyhow, I always say to folks, this is no different. What's on your balance sheet as you come into the year? Do you have any cash? What have you got going? So how much money do you have sitting in reserves or sitting in your working capital that will help you think about moving forward and kind of addressing the uncertainty in a budget. So that's even more true right now, because as we're saying, FY22 and FY23 is kind of scary. So how does your balance sheet look? So let's look at this group. If you look at them right now, you can see they have some cash. They're a $5.2 million organization. So it looks like they have some cash, $1.5 million. They have their investments of 5.1. Remember I said that's mostly endowment. So that's pretty good. They own a building or a space, so they have to have, that's part of their balance sheet assets. And you can see their line of credits out, as we told you. They have a little bit of advanced ticket sales. Their accounts payable is not too bad. All in all, when you look at their unrestricted net assets, which is where we want to make sure you have money always, they have two parts, board designated 845. Remember 845,000 we said in the setup. The board chair is worried and the finance chair is worried it's not enough because FY22 feels uncertain. And then undesignated is 2.9. And then with donor restrictions is the 5.6. So that's their temporarily restricted money and their endowment. So in a little foreshadowing of about what we're about to look like, we always run a little test, which we would tell all of you, you should run at all times and make sure you understand this number. We take your total unrestricted net assets, which in this case is the 3,829,000 that it's the board designated, undesignated added together. We subtract the PP&E, which is an asset you cannot convert to cash, and we figure out how much you have really available. So here when we did that calculation, it came out to 134,000. But remember, they think they have board designated at 845. They don't. So let's talk about that. So when the group talked about it, the board designated reserves, they believe, were 845, and that they were okay with that because that was around 2 months of expenses. But as we just looked at, it's only in liquid unrestricted net assets, what's really there that is not tied up in property and equipment is 134,000, 2 weeks of expenses. So the CEO and finance chair were really surprised given the fact that they thought they had $850,000 in the designated savings account. Remember, we said they had $1.5 million in cash. But a closer look revealed that the cash in that account came from a combination of the line of credit, the fact that they hadn't paid some accounts payable, and most importantly, the deferred subscription revenue. So their liabilities were providing the actual cash as opposed to their assets being cash. So that's a problem. So AP, now they face a choice. They can keep their original budget and accept the fact that they only have 2 weeks of reserves moving into the year. Or they can use the $600,000 surplus from FY21 to replenish their reserves closer to what they thought they had. So that becomes a choice. So when we look at this part of the case, we would ask you to think about your own good selves and say, how well capitalized are you? And I know for many of you, myself or Rachel, have had conversations with you all about this very test. When we get to the poll later on, we're going to ask you this question about would you apply the surplus to the reserves or cut the budget? So I'm just giving you a heads up that later we're going to ask you this question. So I want you to think about it for APG. But this piece is the most important first piece before you understand how to apply any windfall funding anywhere. Where are you right now? Do you understand how much liquid unrestricted net assets you have? So I'm going to stop and say, does anybody have any questions about this piece, about how we calculated it, why it's important? I will say that for many of you, we have done this math sometimes and you have been equally surprised. Any questions?
Susan, it's Samantha again.
Hey, Samantha.
What percentage of or arts organizations would you say would find themselves in this sort of situation?
Probably about a third to a half.
Okay.
A really significant number. And I think it is one of the things we don't look closely enough at in the sector. And without understanding that part of your balance sheet, what you really have, you really do not have a handle on your cash and what you can really accomplish and not.
Thanks.
But it's very common. Okay. Everybody good? Great. Okay. So now that we understand that they have to really think about how much reserves they have, APG also needs to think about, well, what level of uncertainty are we really facing? What kind of reserves do we need? Because, wow, 2 weeks, that's not a lot. That's not great. Maybe in certain times we could do that, but I don't know. How uncertain are we? So this figuring out of what level of uncertainty do you face in your budget is really important. So this group thought, wow, we put all our sales in the second half of the year for FY22 because we're going back slowly, but we hope by in our fiscal year is July to June. We think that in the fall we'll come back slowly, but really we think we'll be full tilt by the spring. And so when we really look at that, that's our best guess. But when we kind of measure what could go wrong, we think that maybe up to $500,000 of our sales could be at risk. We also keep ducking this idea of salaries, we hope, but we really need to hire people. So if we actually had to raise salaries and then we had to go in and fix other people's salaries because we had to give new people more money and then we had parity problems, Christmas, we have a problem here too. And we could have to move up salaries by $250K. So remember, we also said that we really needed FY22 giving to kind of perform at FY21 levels, which we knew were very high. We think, and we're hoping that many folks will come in unrestricted. But there's some folks we don't know. So we total it all up and we think, well, really, that delta is 600K. If we went back to FY19-20 trend lines, we could be down by 600K. And then, we have key development and marketing positions that are not filled. And so net, that's 100K that we might need to put those back in. However, we should say we have a other optimistic view, which is people got pent-up demand. We've been looking at some audience demand studies. People want to come and do things as soon as they feel comfortable. They want to spend some money. There are people who want to come back. We could actually beat expectations between 600 and 900K. We could do better. So our total level of uncertainty is about $1.4 million. And our total level of opportunity is between 600 and 900K. So this idea of kind of quantifying what is the risk and opportunity for the coming year and really thinking about that as you start to think about what does my balance sheet need to really look like was really important. So for you, we would ask, what level of uncertainty do you face? And in a few minutes, we were going to ask for APG, would you not only think about restoring the reserves back to the 865 they thought they had, but would you even increase it because of this level of uncertainty? And here the question they ask themselves is, would you increase it to $1 million? So questions about how we think about uncertainty, opportunity, got to look at both sides. Nope. So then the question of cash, which of course, as you all know, after the last couple of years, if you didn't know it before, you definitely know it now. Budget and cash are two different things. They affect each other, but truly cash is king in the end. So APG worried that their cash cycles had really changed. Subscriptions were coming in later. They're doing single ticket sales. They're in the second half of the year. Most of their gifts come in December year end and key grants come in mid-year. Their line of credit was already tapped out. So kind of trying to figure out how the fall was going to work around cash itself was a little scary. So they sat down and really did their cash flow analysis and showed that they would have a hard time making payroll in September when when and if they return to a full complement of staff. If they had actually stayed at the lower staff levels, they probably would have been okay, but gearing back up, which is what they're trying to do, made them think, oh, do we have enough cash? So they have options they were going to think about. Increasing their line of credit. Could they do that? Of course, cutting the budget, cutting expenses. They could borrow from the endowment or increase the draw, which is not always wonderful, but there it was. They could ask all their donors to give earlier than December. Or they could use the windfall as an internal line of credit. Again, not spend it as part of their budget, but hold on to it. So this question we ask is, will you have the cash at the right time to gear back up? Questions about this part, about the cash? Great. So outside of the budget altogether, APG really had to think about what they needed to invest in, because they learned a lot of lessons in the pandemic, and they really realized that they probably needed some investments just as much as to move themselves forward, that may be one time in nature or maybe not. So they really were struggling with their digital product. You know, a lot of folks on the board really wanted them to go digital. There was some, early evidence said that there was some interest. Everybody in the industry is talking about digital. But they came at it as best they could. They got some equipment that worked. Some of the stuff was high quality. They worried it wasn't high quality enough. They don't know how competitive they are. So when they sat back and said, what would it take us to really understand how we're working in this space, they thought they needed about $350,000 between consultants and equipment and people really helping them think through what audience demand is. They really needed to invest $350,000, which was nowhere in their budget. Their equity committee echoed their CEO's concerns about not having enough resources for the pandemic, to work post-pandemic. And they thought between, again, people to help them think it through, but also excess staff capacity, they needed about another $150,000 for this work. So altogether, they had about $500 of unbudgeted investments that they really thought, as they came out of the pandemic, they needed to invest if they really wanted to kind of make decisions about these two key strategic issues. So they had these options. They could raise more money in an already stressed field. They could limp forward without the investment. They could try their best. Or they could decide not to do the work since they couldn't make the investment. And I think one of the things here that we always ask people to think about is that last point. Do you want to try to do strategic things without the dollars or the capacity? Or do you want to actually breathe in and say, we're not going to do it? And understand that some of them, that sometimes you're throwing good money after bad. And what are the implications of all those things? So the question we would ask you is, what do you need to invest in? And can you afford to do it? And how would you think about it? But the poll question we're going to ask you in a few minutes is, for APG, would you have them limp forward without the investment, or stop the DEI and digital efforts if you couldn't fully invest in them? Because right now they're thinking raising the money with everything they've got to do feels really hard. Okay. And then this is just for the folks on who have deferred revenue, but this question was important for this group. APG's finance committee chair wanted to confront the use of advanced subscription ticket sales. He said, I'm tired of the CEO making our programming choices based on the need for advanced sales. It leaves no room for expectation. The past year demonstrated how hard it was to refund money already spent. So he proposed the following: segregating the cash from advanced ticket sales, not using it until the next season, and drawing it down quarterly, and then doing the same for FY23 advanced sales, with the first release happening in the quarter of FY23. So for those of you on the call who do have subscription revenue, we would ask you, should you address deferred revenue? How dependent are you on advanced sales? And how does your dependency influence your decision making? And I'm going to stop and ask, does anybody have any questions about this part? I know a few of you in the performing arts are going, that's never going to happen, but it's something this organization really wrestled with. So here we go. Altogether, here's their choices. They can use the FY21 surplus to replenish the reserve and cut the budget, or they can raise more money. They can find a way to raise the reserve to $1 million, a balance between the uncertainties of 1.5 and the opportunity of 600. They can make moves to increase access to cash. They can invest 500K, and should they invest in digital and equity work? And should they fix the dependency on advanced ticket sales moving forward? So we're going to run a poll right now and ask you what you would do. Here's the questions. Would you apply the FY21 surplus to the reserves and cut the budget? Would you opt to increase the reserves to $1 million if you could? Would you limp forward without the investment or stop the investment in the two key strategic areas? And would you consider segregating advanced ticket revenue and releasing it over time? So Julie was going to put up the poll and ask you all to vote. And you have plenty of time, no rush.
Susan, can I ask a question while we're doing the poll?
Absolutely.
So for reserve, what expectation is there about when and how it might be used when you say reserve? And $1 million, would that be invested or sitting in cash?
So we would say that it would be used against all the things that we think we could go wrong, all those lists of uncertainties and opportunities. So it would be applied to the FY22 or 23 budget or whatever budget where we had failures. So if things went sideways, you would actually move it in from your reserve. If you're really thinking about it as reserves, at least a portion of it would have to be in cash, and your overall investment strategy, we would have to talk about your overall investment strategy, how you invest all your money, but you would want some liquidity so you could tap it. But that would have everything to do with how your overall, if you had more money than that million, how much cash you had available from all your investments. So that's a vague answer to your question, but it really is about an overall investment strategy. But a good chunk of it would have to be liquid.
Susan, it's Mary Kershaw here from Museum
Hi,
of
Mary.
Northern Arizona. Good
Yeah.
morning.
Morning.
I have a question on number 3.
Yep.
And I'm facing a dilemma because I would neither limp forward without the investment nor stop the efforts. But I would look at the totality of what we're doing and seeing, is there something we're doing now that we did pre-pandemic that we're planning on returning to that we're not going to do, or at least we're not going to do in the short term, and instead do something different? Because it seems to me this is a moment for us to really be looking at, okay, how do we do things differently? Because people are more forgiving right now.
So yeah, so Mary, I think yeah. So I hear that dilemma, and you can that's one of the things when we stop the poll, I'm going to ask people to put that kind of commentary into the room, because I think that's where we're going on some of these questions. So if you don't want to pick, you don't have to, but yeah, that's some of the stuff I'm going to ask you back. So thank you. Thank you for doing that, because that's what we want. We want to talk about some of the stuff.
Okay, thank you.
Sure. And I just advanced this without needing to. Going to give you another couple minutes. All right, has everybody answered who wants to answer? Yep, I think everyone has. Yep. So let's look at what you all said. 58 to 42% said that yes, they would. 42 said no, they would not apply the surplus. Would not cut the budget. Would you increase the reserves? Majority of you said you would try to increase the reserves. Would this question about would you limp forward without the investment or stop the DEI and digital efforts? Again, 45-55. And this does my heart good. The subscription revenue, you would really try to address this in this moment. 87%. Everybody got the poll answers? Yeah. All right. So does anybody want to talk a little bit about why they answered question 1, yes or no? Why would you cut? Why would you apply the surplus, or why would you not? No?
I'll offer a thought. This is Dan from the Heard Museum.
Hi, Dan.
Frankly, hi, Susan. Frankly, just for no other reason than what we've learned, from the past year and a half of what it means or what it might mean to enter, an uncertain and unknown situation, which I think we all believe, or I believe we're still in, without, enough reserves to make it through at least a certain period of time. So it's really my response to yes, or saying yes, was frankly just a reflection, especially on the past year and a half.
Yep.
So Susan, Craig from the Desert Museum.
Hi, Craig.
Hi there. I guess I just have a little bit of a different perspective. Listening to the issues that they have with recruiting and retaining and salaries, I feel like that sometimes if we try to cut ourselves, I realize there's short-term considerations that you always have to address. But since this is a longer-term problem, I guess I would be concerned about going and cutting the budget when it seems like it's already too lean to support what they need, and that essentially you cut yourself and try to reduce expenses into non-existence.
Yep. Other folks?
This is Gerd from Scottsdale Arts. I want to expand a little on Craig's comment. So we had carved out about a 1.2 million or so out of our admin cost before the pandemic, which had moved us in the right direction. So when the pandemic struck, we were actually on track to have a significant surplus before all the federal dollars became available to us. So my answer to this was, yes, I would apply the surplus to our reserves, but then I wouldn't necessarily cut the budget because our budget was already right-sized. And actually, it naturally constricted during the pandemic because, we do a lot of different things, but we have a big performing arts component. And in that, our budget shrunk down significantly just because we didn't do shows, right? Or we didn't do a whole lot of shows. We did, however, also not lay off staff. So we came through this thing fully staffed. But so we didn't have to face the conundrum of restaffing up and hiring at a higher price point because we gave people raises throughout the pandemic. We built some loyalties and could come back with a little bit more ease, perhaps. And so for us, the decision was simply, we tucked away just about every bit of federal dollars that was available throughout the pandemic into our reserves. And yet we came out with a pretty normal budget into this fiscal year.
Okay. All right. Anybody else about the yes and no? Because I think we've heard the real yin and yang that I know this organization actually struggled with. Like, oh my God, this budget is so skinny already. Are you kidding me? $600,000. I've got all these problems. And oh my God, 2 weeks of reserves. Oh my goodness.
Susan, this is Paul Meacham in Tucson.
Hi, Paul. How
Hi,
are you?
Susan. I'm good, thank you. I answered no to question 1 because I answered yes to question 4. On the basis that, in a sense, by segregating the advanced ticket revenue and releasing it over time, you're kind of creating a reserve.
Mhm.
I mean, you don't want to have to go back to drawing on that, but it struck me that that was a more important discipline, which you want to try and instill, but you still have that as a backstop if
Yep.
all else fails. So that was my reason for answering the no to number one.
That's a very interesting point of view. Very helpful, very thoughtful. Other folks? Okay, so everybody, the majority of you really wanted to go to the more increased reserves one way or another. Anybody want to talk a little bit about why, or if for people who said no, why not?
Susan, this is Mary again.
Hi,
I was
Mary.
one of the people who said no.
Okay, good.
And it was really because I said yes to number one and would like to build the reserves back up and maybe ultimately have an ambition to get to 1 million.
Yep.
But at this moment in time, it feels like doing it gradually rather than in it one big jump.
In one big spot.
Yeah.
Yep.
Seems more comfortable to me.
Yep. Other folks?
Susan, this is Rita Bostic. I work with the Children's Museum, but and I can't speak for the overall. I can just say this as an economist. I am not. Our economy is still undefined, and I believe that I also voted no because I think we just need to keep our fingers, be more proactive in our budget. I do know that at the Children's Museum we kept a rolling 3-month budget.
Yep.
During the pandemic, and I just think that we're not through with that yet.
Yep.
And the uncertainty in the marketplace with so many different factors, it just, I want the reserves as to a degree as an escrow, a sinking fund, whatever you want to call it, but also keep our fingers on top of the expenses and what we might do. But that's a different answer, but thank you very much for your time. It's a great seminar.
Yeah. Other folks?
This is Gert again, Susan.
Yeah.
I probably would have liked to answer number two, sort of yes, but I would put the $1 million in reserves because we are still in a time of uncertainty and we need to have a buffer fund. But I would also try to carve out a portion of that money to I think so. The other side of capitalization is an innovation fund, an investment fund, something that will actually earn more than the market or more than outpacing inflation. So what we try to do is simply set aside $500,000 that we can use as play money when there's opportunity or things we can jump on or things that we can really use to propel ourselves forward, be that digital investments or other things that might become available and promising right now.
It makes sense. And you are foreshadowing the second half of the case, so good for you. Other folks? Okay, let's look at 3, which I think Mary set up for us very nicely. We set it up as a yin or yang, 2 choices, but what do people really think about this idea of, they really they think they need $500,000 to do these different types of investments. And that's probably underestimating because we all know you all try to do it with as little as possible. What do you think about these choices? About the fact that they were unbudgeted, incredibly important to their strategy? What do folks think? And again, Mary, you set us up nicely.
This is Van Wolf, LA, Arizona. I think the problem with stopping the DEI and digital efforts, if you couldn't fully invest in them, you set yourself up for failure, and that really can potentially harm your reputation.
Yep. So you have to move forward somehow, is what you're saying. Somehow.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
It's Dan from the Heard Museum. Also, there's not really, it's not a choice, these days. Anybody who is seeking grants, for example, from any funder, any institutional funder, if if you say you're stopping your DEI efforts because you don't have funding or budget for them, you're dead in the water.
Yep. Other folks?
Susan, Craig from the Desert Museum. I don't disagree with what I've just heard, but I also know that with the efforts that we're engaged in, that without approaching it the right way, there's great risk of doing actually sometimes worse damage by taking a misstep than not taking a step.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. I think you're seeing a lot of nodding. Other folks? Okay. And so then the last piece was a little bit about the subscriptions, and I'm heartened to see 87. This is one place where I think the pandemic has offered us an amazing opportunity because it reset the dial. So for those who are struggling with this issue, I think this is an amazing moment. Any conversation about this for folks about advanced ticket sales?
Van Wolf again, Bel Air, Arizona. I think it's an intriguing idea, but it requires incredibly careful advanced thinking.
Yep. And I think you'll see what they did in a minute. I think that's right. Very thoughtful plans how to do it. Yep. Can't be just done overnight. Okay. So let's see what they did. So they did cut the budget and added the surplus to the reserve. They worked with a core donor to top up the reserve to $1 million. It was actually a board member who said, I can't tolerate this much risk as a board member, and help them get to $1 million. They did, even though they were able to do that, they also worked with the bank to increase their line of credit because they didn't want to immediately use all the money for a line of credit. So they just wanted to have a backstop because it was all played out. So they got a little bit of room. They did indeed work with their long-term donors and board members who had been so generous and flexible during 20 and 21 and said, if you could move up your gift till September and October for our cash flow, that would be great. And some folks did. And they agreed to start to segregate the cash from the FY22 advanced ticket sales. The numbers were pretty small, so it didn't feel too terrible because it wasn't, again, it was an opportunity for them because it wasn't really there. So between increasing their line of credit, getting their cash pulled up, getting their reserves up, again, I think Paul said this earlier, it all started to come together for them that they could probably segregate some of that cash. So they did a move of stuff around a little bit like Mary talked about. They decided to postpone some of their investment in digital and do fewer streamed concerts than originally budgeted. And then they moved some of that money around in their budget to increase their capacity on equity issues because they felt they couldn't stop. They'd come so far that if they tried to stop in any way, shape, or form. And while they couldn't quite spend the money that they wanted to, they spent more money than they had originally thought. So that resulted in this, a balance sheet that looked like this. And you can see their cash is up. Their advanced ticket sales are intact. They have available restricted net assets of $1 million. Their investments are up partially because of the market, but partially because they did not borrow like they thought they might. Their PPP loan converted and dropped to the bottom line. And they did pull a little bit more money from their line of credit, but they think they see ways not to do that moving forward. So this is what their balance sheet looked like at the end of that moment. And here was their budget. So their incomes did not change. But as you can see what they did, and this is, Craig, I will point you here that could make people nervous because they did the things that may make them nervous. They dropped their programming investment. Some of that, they dropped their marketing investment. They cut a little more into admin. That hurt. They decided that cutting into development was cutting their nose off to spite their face because it was where all the money was coming from. So they didn't do that. But you can see they put money into DEI and they decreased their hybrid. And that left them with a modest deficit. But you can see then what they applied their surplus to was they got a one-time gift from their board member. So they applied 866 to their reserves, and that's how they got back to $1 million. So you can see the choices were not, we just said those choices as if they were, oh, no big deal, but these actually imply painful decisions about how they did it. But the story, as you know, does not end there because we foreshadowed what bigger windfall money, remember? So they did this. They
Susan,
did.
we have a question.
Yep, sorry.
Can you address the need to increase salaries to retain and hire with the lean budget?
Yep, so that's exactly the risk that they took. And when you look at this, that is the thing that I believe goes unaddressed in this solution. And again, as Craig made the point, making the cuts has real implications, but they were hoping that they could address the bigger issues, some of these bigger issues, as they got through 22 and moved into 23. So, yep, that's a huge issue walking into these choices. Okay, but again, they truly believed they never would have this opportunity again to get their reserves to the point where they actually had some defensive money, and that they thought that this was a one-time opportunity, that the posting of the $600,000 surplus was not going to come again. Okay. So, but wait, there's more. So they got the SVOG, the Save Our Venues grant. Turns out after all that pain, anguish, votes, things that they thought they didn't want to do, they got it. And late breaking news, a donor who has really been talking to them for about 6 or 7 months, who's given them a nice donor, really has had a tremendous run up in the stock market and thinks, I'd like to give you some real money. I really would like to give you some real money. I cannot tell you how many times this has happened in the interviews that we have conducted. So this is not a Hail Mary idea. This is just that this is happening, right? So altogether, $2.6 million in unrestricted one-time capital. And they've already passed the budget and made the choices and done the things, right? So this really is a choice moment. What do we do? Because 2.6 million, it seems like a lot, doesn't seem like a lot, but at $5.2 million budget, it's like half the budget. So what does that mean? What does that really mean? So they started by asking themselves this question, because Kate just asked this question, right? Well, maybe we need to relook at FY22 first, because we made some really painful choices. So what do we want to do about that? Do we want to fully fund DEI efforts? Do we want to increase salaries? Do we want to bring back the digital programming and invest in infrastructure? Do we want to go back and increase programming? And how much do we want to increase programming? That 2.6 was already a low number. We cut it to 2.3. Do we want to bring it back to 2.6, or do we want to do more? Oh my gosh, what do we want to do? And this marketing thing, this is something we always do. We keep cutting the marketing and hoping for more sales. We do it all the time. We do it in every budget. Maybe we should restore that marketing, and maybe we should actually look at that number harder. So those are choices we really need to think about for FY22, because we understand it's windfall money. We understand it's not permanent money. We understand it's never going again. But can this help us in the uncertainty of 22 in ways that will actually set us up to address some of the things we just have to address in order not to go into a circle downwards? So maybe we've just gotten lucky and this can help us in 22. Well, equally importantly is FY23. and we've heard this from all of you as well as from our cohort members around the country. Are we going to have similar types of sales risks in FY23 that we have in 22? You know, how long is the pandemic effect happening? We don't know. 23 scares some people just as much as 22. Really, that's really what we're really thinking is how long does this donor pipeline hold up? Is a permanent shift? Or, you know, in 23, are we going to start to see people feel a little less urgent? So should we use some of this money to set it aside for our FY23 budget? But really what that question really is our $1 million reserve. We took the pain, you know, did we set it at the right level? Will we spend it in FY22? That's Samantha's question of how liquid should it be? Or do we think, you know, we'll have enough of it left to kind of move into 23? What is our thinking there? Any questions about their questions? The FY23 piece? Okay. So here's the other horrible thing they realized. You know, this conversation about they don't have any working capital. Because if you look at this calculation, they stuck all their money in reserves. You know, that sloshy money you need every day, that's all coming from their line of credit, which could be fine. They have positive, you know, they have positive earner, that could be fine. But none of their money has got really they got no real working capital. So is that a problem? Or can they keep living with their own, you know, using the bank as their working capital? That could be fine. Really, what do they want to do here? Because they, you know, are so used to living on their line of credit, they never step back and really said, oh, we don't have any working capital. And the $1 million reserve felt like such a big push that they never really grappled with this issue. Here was their real, yep.
Can you remind me if APG decided to put their deferred revenue in a segregated account in this? Okay.
Yep.
All right.
Yep. And to Paul's point, there's something good about that, right? Maybe, what does that mean? There's something helpful there. All right. But here's the big question that this $2.6 million windfall made them really think about. Hey, does our business model work? So as we think about how to apply this money, maybe we should look at our overall trends and think about really what the business is doing and not doing. You know, 22 was getting through out of the pandemic and having enough cash to live to fight another day and making enough strategic choices that we can get back to where we want to be. But this amount of money makes us think, one-time money that we might never see again, makes us want to look at our trends. So way back when we started this case, I mentioned to you that their earned income trends were pre-pandemic were declining or flat. And they weren't happy about that, but you know, pandemic made a much worse problem, so they stopped thinking about that too much. This digital thing itches them. It's like, what is our role here? Is this a thing? Is this not a thing? I don't know. It's really hard. But we need to kind of really confront it, and confronting it on the edges doesn't feel like we're getting anywhere. It's increasing salary demands, as you know, as Kate said, when they ignored it, they felt kind of sick to their stomach because they don't think it's going anywhere. And if they had to be honest, it was happening pre-pandemic. If they really have to be, it's just made it worse. And this long-term commitment to DEI efforts, again, this is if they really are thought about it and as they've gotten deeper into it, this isn't a one-time investment in $150,000. This is about how we changed the way we do business. And that might have real impacts on how we spend money. Because if we're changing operationally, we got some real issues we got to talk about here. And then this underinvestment in marketing, again, we went back and really looked at it when we were confronted what to do with some of our money at first. And we have not really reconciled marketing and sales and marketing and development and marketing and everything else. And are we in or are we out? We're all over the map here. We really don't have a way to talk about whether or not our marketing is effective because we've been bouncing all over the map, cutting, changing? Is it connected to the earned income trends? Is it something else with the earned income trends that was happening culturally? What, we don't know, but it's not good. So they thought they needed to look really hard to see if they could shift their model. So they asked themselves, what experiments or pilots could APG undertake? How much might to kind of push on these ideas? How much might those experiments cost? And over what period of time would they be willing to conduct those experiments? Because one of the things they also know is many times they have done experiments or pilots and they do them once and then make a judgment on them once, as opposed to understanding that some things take multiple tries to understand whether or not they work. So what should we do? So Gerd, you foreshadowed this. Well, the question they wanted to ask themselves is, should we send set aside some of our funds for what we call change capital, money to invest in ourselves that we intentionally spend over time against thoughtful bets to change our business model? Can we think about changing our model? Because right now, if we have to be honest, if we run our model out, it doesn't work. That's the way we want it to work. Yep.
And Susan, before you move to the next slide, we have another question in the chat.
Thank you. We're contemplating making some target salary. Do I have thoughts on this? I do, and we'll talk about it in a few minutes. I do have thoughts about and raises an uncertain part. Yep. All right. We will talk about that in a couple minutes. So. All right.
Susan, a question about testing and investments.
Yep.
Investing in marketing, obviously you want to see an ROI return on your investment.
Yep.
The challenge I face at the moment is I don't have any history to really realistically project, if I invest X, I'm going to get this.
Yeah.
And I'm reluctant to put a budget number in for that expected ROI. I think from an accountability and an evaluation standpoint, we can't choose a number, but to make an investment and assume that it's going to get X amount, we're increasing the risk of that revenue.
So I agree. So that's why having capital set aside to support that change, Samantha, is the most important thing, because the way you would evaluate the worth is to say to yourself, if I spent $5 today to get, what do I need to see back over time to make that happen? So I might say that in the first year, I don't need to see any of it back. And by the way, I have $5 sitting in the bank that's going to cover it. But if I spend that $5 the next year because I saw some upward tick, maybe I got $4 of it back, $3 of it back. Great. And that helps me keep investing. So next year, but by the next year I see, oh, I kind of broke even. Is that worth it to me? It could be. I got more people in the door. I have more people who know me. I have a different audience. The composite of who I got from that $5 is different. So that might be a criteria I use for investing for my ROI. And then I could say, or I might need to see $6 and I need to see it by year 3. So what makes it worth it to make the investment? What are you chasing from the investment in marketing? And it can be net sales. I made more money than I spent over time. It could be flat because I want more people in the door. I want more potential donors. I want more people talking about me. From a mission standpoint, I just want more people seeing my art. There's a whole bunch of different reasons. And then I will say that in a lot of our practice, we are seeing people also shifting their marketing dollars to understand how it motivates donors. Donors, as you all know, give to success and successful stories. And there's a lot of research that tells us that the more people understand your success through your telling your own tale, i.e. marketing, it really affects donors thinking about how they want to give to you. So there's a multiplicity. So that's my long-winded answer is to say, It's about what you think makes it worth it. But having capital sitting on your balance sheet to invest in for the first couple of years and protect yourself from the need for an ROI that is cash, while you decide while you see if those criteria work out, is really what's important. And that's, I think, what we're trying to say for this organization. Wow, they have some money they could invest, and they would need to be able to see that ROI, whatever they say it needs to be, to develop over time, and it wouldn't have to be a one shot. Which is what I
Thank
think.
you. Thank
I
you,
think
Susan.
you put your finger on it, that one has to play this as a long game.
That's right.
It's not an ROI in 1 year. You have to, if you're going to increase your investment in something, you have to anticipate that the ROI will take time to do. And that's going to be a very difficult thing. What time frame do you set up as the way you evaluate it?
That's right. That's right.
If I can add that, so it's interesting because I think you aptly name it change capital, because it's the 3 or 4 or 5 year change plan you have. You want to develop new audiences or refresh your audiences or whatever it might be. And so the financial return might actually be a secondary or tertiary because you're playing a longer game. So if you're not funded for that period, then, we often try something new and we give up because we run out of cash the next year. But I also want to add that I think we're in a unique moment where it's not just about, we already recognized over the years we have to change, evolve, and revamp our business models. And many of us, I think, have been forced to look at that, and I think that's a healthy thing. But also coming out of COVID, I feel that we have to, our market just collapsed, right? Similar to, say, the tourism industry. So we have to first now rebuild our market. And then in that moment, we have an opportunity to maybe weave in this change idea to develop a new market share, right? Or to revamp our model. But that, I think, makes it particularly complex right now to think through this. Why is the audience not returning to me? Is it because my market's gone and I have to rebuild it? Is it because I haven't touched the new audiences and my business model is failing? Maybe you can give us some thoughts on that.
Yeah, and Gerd, I think that's a conversation that we are having with everyone. And I will say through some of this synthesized work, where some of these folks have this same conversation. One of the things we find most interesting about how audiences are returning right now, and this is on both the museum side and the performing arts, both on both sides of the equation, is that new long-term audiences, the ones we thought were going to be the first ones back, are not necessarily the first ones back. The first ones back are people who are culturally inclined, who are interested and are looking for something to do, and may be a little younger, maybe a little less worried about being out in the world. And so those folks are some of the first ones back that we've been seeing. I'd be really interested to hear what you guys have been seeing, but it's been fascinating to watch. What's interesting about that is, well, does that mean that we're just seeing a delay in our long-term audiences? Like if they just need another year? Do they just need another year? Or is it change of habit? And change of habit is something people are really interested in. And then for the newer audiences, what we all know is that the newer audience behavior is not as sticky as older audience behavior. I've been looking at some museum information that's been fascinating to me, that younger audiences, when you ask them the question of whether or not they're loyal, if they come once a year and they think they're insanely loyal, whereas an older audience member, a museum going member, thinks 6 to 8 times is loyal. I go 6 to 8 times to my membership museum, where if I'm a member and I'm in my 30s, I go once and I think I'm insanely loyal to you because I come every year. So, there's a lot of things I think about changing participation that, again, I think is mixed into all these things that we need to talk about. So that's my conversation there. And to the point that is being made in the chat about salaries, I think this is, I would say the arts and culture field has gotten through for many years on sweat equity. underpaying. You know, if you actually asked what truly funds the sector, I would tell you it's sweat equity. And I think we're seeing, before the pandemic, we were seeing generational shift that said, that's not cool. That's not cool. And then if you go through an equity lens, you know, there are people who can afford to work in the sector, and there are people who can't afford to work in the sector. And those choices are made before you even get to the door. So understanding how your pay schedules and your pay structures, which are dependent on lower salaries, affect your ability to recruit a diverse staff and to be equitable in how you treat them is really an issue, a huge issue. So I think that's something that, again, is part of this business model conversation. Like, how do we think about that? To the point about, though, bonusing that Kate made, trying to do both at the same, I think, and one-time bonuses, I think, is really important. The one thing I will say about one-time bonuses is you have to be really clear they're one-time bonuses. And when I say really clear, I mean really clear. People will sometimes say in the next year, well, why didn't I get another bonus? So I think you have to think about, are you setting up expectations that is a behavioral change, or is this like you can actually tie it to something that says this is why you're getting the one-time bonus? And you know, sometimes with windfall dollars, you can do that. We got a windfall, so we're going to share it with you. But I think that is something that's real. All right, so this was their big question. What should they do? So here's what they did. And then I'm going to ask you, what I'm going to ask you all is, do you agree or disagree with what they did? They undid the cuts to programming and the administrative budgets, bringing them back up to where they were. They increased the marketing budget up above what was in the original FY22 budget. They increased the DEI and hybrid expenses relative to the updated budget that they had before. They actually thought, we're going to create a little bit of a working capital fund. And they added the remaining windfall capital to a newly created change capital fund. And they created a nimble new ideas committee, because what's money without a committee, to vet and monitor pilots and experiments. And they thought, let it be consumable. We actually are saying affirmatively that we're going to spend it over the next 3 years. We're going to try things over a 3-year period. They picked 3 years. So this is what their budget ended up looking like. If you look at the windfall on the right-hand side of the expenses, again, the income stays about the same. They pulled their expenses based up almost $900,000, putting the programming back, making almost doubling marketing, restoring administration, getting back to the actual amount of money they wanted to spend in DEI, not going all the way up with hybrid, but thinking that's where they wanted to go, posting a $900,000 loss, of which they applied the 1.6 and the $1 million. They had a remaining windfall of $1.6 million. They put $500,000 just to the bottom line for working capital. And then they put $1.1 million into their change capital fund. They thought about the working capital long and hard and thought it might end up, as long as they could still have a good relationship with the bank, they had other money stuck aside in different places, that they would try not to be so reliant on the credit line. But this gave them another way of flexibility. So if they had to have working capital through the credit line, they could still have that piece as well. So this is a little bit of a belt and suspenders approach, but this group was scared through the pandemic. They got scared, but they really believed that the business model thing was really scary. So that's why they took almost $1.2 million and put it into change capital. Okay, so here's the poll question. Would you do what they did? Yes or no? It's a blunt instrument event, but then we're going to talk about it.
Susan, would you like me to share the results?
Yep, anybody else want to vote quick? Okay, go ahead. So most of you would do what they did and a few of you would not. So kind of jump in and talk about what you think about the poll, about what they've done.
Susan, I have a question around presentation to funders, because if I look at this, their audit, if things go to plan, will show a deficit, which has been, managed through the funds that they have available for cash to close that. But and sophisticated funders like the Flinn Foundation and some of the others will understand and do that. But panels on city and state and other and smaller foundations aren't as sophisticated. So any advice when you have 500 characters to indicate what's happening in a online application format that doesn't allow for storytelling, and I don't know if you can speak to that at all, or
Yeah, no. So actually, this group will show what will happen is in 22 they'll show a huge surplus. In 23, if they use their change capital, they won't, because all that money will drop to the bottom line. So they'll show this huge surplus, which is blunt instrument accounting, right? So it basically says that we don't use our equity to move forward. We have been telling people to actually say below the surplus / deficit before application of reserves, just really bluntly, and then application of reserves. We have talked to auditors about putting that in notes in their notes in the back of the thing. We have been successful because we think that's an important narrative to bind in. That people have been using their reserves. That's actually appropriate and in the way it is. But this idea of relabeling, if you are using your balance sheet to appropriately move your organization forward, which is what if you get the capital on your balance sheet, you should be able to do, then we've been actually encouraging people saying surplus and deficit before application of reserves. And then I think that's something that more and more people are getting used to. But again, you asked the question earlier about unrestricted funding. It's a shift in the environment. But if you're not saving capital to sit on it, except for you're saving capital to actually invest in yourself at the right time. But yeah, it's real. That's a real thing you're asking. Other folks about applying the windfall this way or thinking about it differently? Anything you would have done differently? What do you think about this 3-year committee approach to applying the change capital? Good idea, bad idea?
I think it's an interesting idea and an interesting concept. I think it's very actually somewhat brave and innovative to put so much money to change capital. Yep. Most of us tend to think more conservatively. This is pretty aggressive, I think, and I think that's very positive. And having it sort of really giving it a 3-year strategy, not just to say, okay, we're just gonna tuck this all away in this year and see where things go, but simply saying we're going to be committed for 3 years and really investing in ourselves. I think that's very smart.
I think it's obviously a very interesting idea and worth thinking about. I think one trouble you may run into if the committee is board members, there are different tenures for board members. And board members have to be chosen very carefully to sit on this committee because they need to have enough tenure to understand the organization, but also enough tenure to continue to be there.
Yep.
To have a commitment to the change.
I think that's a very good point. I think what I have worked with committees like this before very successfully, but I will say it has been as a result of very thoughtful trustees who understood the business and were dedicated to seeing it to the end. So yes, I think that's right. That's a good point.
Susan, this is Kerry Baldwin, Desert Museum.
Hi.
Hi. I often see, in these unrestricted windfall pots that pop up, there seems to be a generic reluctance to take a percentage of that and dump it into the endowment.
Yep.
As a permanent
Yep.
source of funding for sustainability.
Yep.
And I recognize hard sell for some of the funders, but again, as it's coming in more unrestricted, I wonder if you had some thoughts about why that doesn't happen. And then to the conversation you just had, if you have a board policy that is predetermined that way, that outlives the tenure of a particular board member.
Yep. So I'm going to stop sharing this presentation because this is the end of the presentation. I would love to see your faces more. So everybody good with me pulling this down? Yep. Okay. Hi. So I think two things about that. I think one of the things that I do believe about windfalls permanently, so one of the ways we might have experienced windfalls before an endowment was estate gifts, gifts that were just come across the transom. We never expected them. Mrs. Jones left you $100,000 or $50,000. We highly recommend that those gifts, if you have an endowment approach, if you believe in growing your endowment over time, that is one of the most straightforward ways to add to your unrestricted endowment. Again, we're a big believer in unrestricted endowment so that you can make choices over time, but that has a permanent policy. We often, we often suggest people bind into the notes of their endowment so it survives everything. We think that old-fashioned way of windfalls that we will always continue is a great way to kind of consistently and constantly build your endowment if you have an endowment strategy. It's painless. It doesn't feel painless when you want to apply it to this year's budget, but really it's painless. Here, I think with this kind of windfall, what I think we are cautious about is people have really not good balance sheets. And for those folks who don't have good balance sheets and don't have loose cash, we will never see again in this next decade this kind of money coming into the organization. And repairing balance sheets can change organizations' lives, as the Desert Museum knows. And so once that basic repair has happened, then I'm all for building the unrestricted endowment with other unexpected windfalls. I think if you have an endowment strategy, not all of you do, and it's not appropriate for everybody, but for those who do have an endowment strategy where endowment growth is real, I'm 100, yes, I think that is a wonderful policy. But again, the balance sheet has to look like something first. You gotta have 5 cents of cash and 10 cents of reserve and some money to actually work on making investments first. But yeah. Other folks.
Susan, we have a question in the chat from Ellen.
Yep. What does their FY20 look like to cover the 920 if there is not an immediate change? They're using their windfall money, Ellen. They're using the 2.6 to cover it.
Susan, can I ask a question going back to your last comment about unrestricted endowments? So we changed our how our balance sheet reads in terms of how we treat our investments, because it used to be very unclear in our organization. So we identified we have roughly 2/3 of our total investments now are actually donor restricted endowed funds. And then the other third, which is the part we built up from about 200,000 to about 3.5 million over these last couple of years. That part we now call board restricted reserve funds. Just so everybody better understands the difference, that's actually our cash. So our endowed funds used to be underwater. We finally brought them over water. And so what you're suggesting is we should focus whenever there's a windfall, and hopefully managing to get the donor to agree to add to unrestricted or only board restricted reserves rather than fully endowed funds.
Yes, we are a huge fan of that.
Yeah.
You can make the board restricted. It's acting as endowment. You're using it as endowment. You're
Fully invested. Yeah.
fully invested. You're not using it as a liquidity agent in any way, shape, or form, except in an emergency. Yeah, we're big fans of that. We're big fans of that.
So I have a question based on that, and actually it came up in conversation with Rachel Crocker the other week, and that is, we did not take an endowment draw, an investment draw the last 2 years because we didn't need the cash. We wanted to let the money come back in the market, and it served us well. But we are now contemplating this March to take one, only so that we can literally take money that the donor restricted endowments generate and shift it over into board restricted reserves. Does that make sense? Is that something that's it's kosher to do that?
Yes, yes, and yes.
Fair enough. Thank you.
Yes. Okay. Bonnie asked a question in the chat. Assuming there are existing strategic plans in place, how do these new ideas get prioritized against longer standing needs, which may have been substantially vetted over time? I agree, Bonnie, this is the big question, right? So now you have some capital. The whole idea here is you have some capital to do the thinking. That's why I think for this group, having a committee that actually is smart and thoughtful and is going to debate some of those strategies. Where do we put the money in from long held strategies? These new strategies, do they supersede? Do they enhance? Do we reprioritize? I think that's exactly the right conversation. And that's why this group opted to do a committee, a small, nimble committee, nothing but to actually debate a lot of those things and understand that who says that $1 million was aggressive, but $1 million goes pretty fast. $1 million goes pretty fast. And so how would you actually think about consuming it against the right things? That's exactly right. That's the real issue that we like keep talking about. How are we strategically doing all of it or changing? But think of the joy of actually having $1 million to apply to some of these strategies to test them out. It would be an amazing moment. Other folks, other questions?
Who are you seeing comprising committees that are having these conversations about how to assess this?
So it's usually the CEO, the financial person, a couple of other staff people who are leading strategic parts, and then 2 or 3 board members, usually equal parts. You can do it. We like to say you can do it staff-led, board-informed, or board-led, staff-informed. Those are 2 different ways to come at it. They're both great, depends on what you do, but as long as you're clear who's leading and how you're going to get those decisions made, that's the most important part. But we do think what you need equal set of voices to actually talk it through. And then what we really think of the board members on the committee doing is carrying the water in the best way back to the rest of the board to really talk about it and advocate for what they're thinking about and help educate the rest of the board. I think, not every board member can know everything about the organization. So it's hard to ask the whole board to get in that deep. And I don't know if that would be the best use of everybody's time, but that's what we've been seeing. Daniel. Other folks. Kate.
Hi, Susan. It's Kate from the Children's Museum. Would you touch base on something you mentioned in one of the earlier slides, which was the organization potentially using their own money as an internal line of credit, and how that works and kind of the thinking behind that?
Yep. So, so say you have money that you want to, that's cash that you want to make sure you're not just filling the whole of a budget, but really you're actually just helping with the liquidity of the normal liquidity of the organization. So just the way you have to pay the bank back and be out for 30 days or 60 days or whatever it is, you need to be out of your own credit line for that long. You need to be able to demonstrate, I don't need the cash all the time, right? Otherwise you're filling the hole. that's in it. So if you treat it just the way as an internal, I'm going to use my own cash. I'm not going to pay any interest. I can't make much money because I need this money to be liquid anyway. So here's a really good example. For this APG, they have $1 million now in reserves. If they were forecasting surpluses or break even, and they felt really good about how much money they had, and they thought, I always have a cash crunch in September when my season goes up, and my donors don't come in, and I'm bad. So I'm going to internally borrow for 4 months from myself. But by Christmas, when I even up on cash, I'm going to put all that, I'm going to make sure that $1 million is back in place for at least 30 to 60 days. And it really isn't deficit covering. That's the idea of using your own money, right? It's just playing with the same rules that the bank wants you to play with. Can you demonstrate it's not permanent financing, but it really is liquidity? Yep.
Okay, thank you. There's a couple of, or can I follow up on that if that's okay? There's a couple of organizations, some bigger organizations that I think have some kinds of reserve funds that they use when they have big traveling exhibits that they're paying, deposits for, or they're, kind of advancing themselves on some maybe capital projects.
Exactly.
Is that, what do you consider that? I mean, we call it an innovation fund that we're trying to kind of get off the ground, but how does that, some examples of that maybe, or how to manage that?
Absolutely. So when we do work with people who have what we call a lot of prepaid expenses, so they need to invest today for work that's happening in a year, 2 years out, or 3 years out. That is, to us, is not risk. That's the normal business model. So if you need to be if you need to know that you've had to put deposits on this kind of work or that kind of work, or you had to invest in a partnership to co-pro something or anything like that, we think of that as prepaid, and that your working capital should be able to fund that. So how you size working capital, cash you need in real time, has everything to do with that part of your business model. As opposed to, I'm going to try something risky that is not normal business. I'm going to invest in some new piece of work or new co-pro or something that is outside my business model. I don't know what it's going to look like. I don't know if it's going to pay back. I don't know if people are going to come. All the things that are outside my normal, but I want to take a risk because I want to try new audiences, a new artistic approach, a new pedagogical approach. And I just don't know if it's going to work. That's risk capital or change capital that we just talked about, where you have enough money to bet it and lose it.
Okay, great. Thank you.
Yeah, and I will tell you my favorite change capital story, Kate. We have worked, I've been at capitalization a long time. Many years ago, we worked with a very well-known theater who set up a risk capital fund and did something insanely brave. They charged the artistic side of the business with spending it. Basically said, here's $1 million. You guys figure out what you want to risk. The board kind of breathed in and wanted to vomit a little bit, but they thought, we're going to trust the artists. Here's something insane. And the artists made that fund last for 15 years. 2 reasons. One is no stupid bets, because they knew this was the only time this was their money. So best bets only. Secondly, turns out that a lot of things that you want to do artistically that are risky, actually audiences and other funders want to pay for. So they ended up getting much more cash and earned and unearned revenue for those projects that were artistically vibrant, interesting, and a little bit crazy than they thought they could. But when they didn't, it was covered and they learned something. So there's a lot of really interesting stuff in risk capital, change capital, that if you think creatively about it, can really move your organization in other ways besides just the bet.
Susan,
other folks. Yes.
And Kate, thanks for that question, because we've been talking about different types of capital reserves. Could you kind of lay those out?
One more time.
Maybe in order of priority.
In order of priority, you need working capital first. before anything else, you need to be able to pay the bills. You know what I'm saying? You need enough cash to pay the bills, working capital. In any calculation in my life, I cannot figure out how anybody lives with less than a month's worth of working capital. Most people need more, but kind of crazy talk to say you don't need a month in advance of cash. I don't know what. How do you live? So at least a month. That's the only time I'm ever going to give you an actual measure that is calculated on months. Then you need reserves. You need reserves that are equal to what you think the risk of your business is at any given long time, not in any given month, but in any given year to 3 or 4 years. Like, what is our risk that is real that could happen to us? And how would we have enough money to pull down quickly enough that we could actually make thoughtful change in our business model and live to fight another day? So you size it against that. And what we always say to people, tell us what your riskiest part of income, how could it fall? How fast could it fall? And then what are the expenses you need to protect? And what's the delta? And then how much money would you need to sit in reserves? So that's when people ask me 2, 3, 6 months, I think that's all. We all talk that way, but that's not as helpful as saying, what is it I'm really trying to defend against? That's second. Third, if you have a building, you need a building reserve, because I'm sorry, when the toilet breaks and the seats fall down and the roof leaks, that's where your cash is going, no matter what you want to do. So if you have a building, you need a building reserve. And there's lots of ways you can calculate that. And all of them are good. As long as you're doing something. So, and then after that is change capital, risk capital, money that's your money. There's all sorts of labels: artistic risk fund, a risk fund, change capital fund. They all say the same thing: a pot of money that is unrestricted, that is totally consumable against a set of goals where you want to take risks and challenge the way you work and try different things.
And risk there is intentional risk, not potential risk, as in number 2, the risk reserve.
That's just, reserves is like the pandemic. Yeah. Or the stock market goes wonky on you, or you program a season that doesn't work. If we all could program perfect seasons, we will go work for Hollywood and make a lot of money. So everybody has crappy seasons. That exhibition pattern didn't work. Those 4 ballets, we loved them, but no one really came. You just can't. Public taste is finicky. You got to reserve against it. Or, our longtime, I'll say this to all of you, beloved leaders, our longtime leader left and we stuttered. One of the things that we've studied longitudinally is the time where organizations can consume the most capital off their balance sheet is when leadership changes. It's got its good, it's got its bad, it's got its all, but that in between costs a lot of money. Or, the development director that had all the relationships in the pipeline left. And so everybody stepped back for 6 months. I mean, these things, it's all the crazy stuff that happens, right? That you have to think about. That's reserves.
Susan, I want to follow up on hi, Steve Martin from Child.
Hi, Steve, how are you?
Good, thank you. Ellen put another comment in there about they're then looking forward to the next fiscal year. And, we're finding that we depend a lot on schools. When we were building our budget last April, the response from schools was, we're coming back, we're so excited. And then, the governor and the school districts and everybody started fighting. There was a tremendous amount of uncertainty. We built a budget based on that initial kind of, we're coming back and we're excited. And now it's not coming, it's not happening. And so we're feeling very strongly that the runway to get back to a certain level is going to be not 1 year or 2 years. It's quite possibly going to be 3 years. And so when we look at our reserves, and we look at what our budgets are going to be in 23 and 24, we have to be a lot more cautious in those revenue numbers. But in order, I mean, it costs the same for us to produce a play for 50 people in the audience as it does for 500 people in the audience. And so we have to really be careful about how we're looking at utilizing those reserve funds over a longer period of time. Because these are, like you said, one-time gifts, you know, and so it's a little frightening, quite frankly.
And I agree with you, Steve. You know, I think that's what we're hearing from people, that people thought 22 would be the scary year, but then we'd reset. Well, first they thought 21 would be the scary year, and then we would reset. And then people thought, no, it's 22, and then we'll reset. But now I think a lot of folks are thinking 23 might give us the reset valve, might make us understand like what the level playing field is. And then we would move from 23, but 22 is not going to tell us what the level playing field is. And to, I think it was Gerd's point, like really how are audiences and partners going to behave? You know, I would also bring up with schools that we are seeing, as people talk about addressing the learning deficits that have come from pandemic, what is the role of arts and culture in curriculum and school and after school when these learning deficits have been huge? The flip side of that opportunity is, I'm sure you're seeing, but again, no one knows what the level playing field is. Schools have all this money to actually do something about the learning deficits. So how do you tap into it? Yeah, we're in crazy town. I think that's the technical term. We're in crazy town.
Susan, can you talk a little bit about setting expectations, both with board and staff? Big chunks of money coming in, tend to set the expectation, well, is this going to go on, right? And I think we need to have honest conversations and not screw our budgets, because now we feel like, well, this is coming back, right, and then it won't for some time.
Yeah, I think that's right. I think that's why, you know, we're a big believer in budgets as kind of moral documents, like what are the commitments we're making that we can ethically stand behind. And I think getting people to understand what you can stand behind with what windfall money and what you can't stand behind, that, you know, that conversation we started with today about what windfall money does and doesn't, as an organizational wide discussion, I think is really important. And being really transparent about that and being really honest about what these dollars are, I think is incredibly important and hard. But I would also say the flip of that is, and that's why I do think there are moments where when you get a windfall and you can say, I can adjust your salaries by X or our programming investment by Y, but I can't go higher. There is a moment though where you do have to ask yourself, should I be bonusing? I do think this bonusing question that somebody brought up is really important, because there is a moment where you might want to say, well, here, but what we do want to acknowledge that we got a little bit extra, and can we help you? Can we share that, a little bit of that with you? And here's how we responsibly got to that. I do think not doing that at some level, or not sharing, like you said, I think, Gerd, that you continue to give raises and you continue to do, I mean, not doing something about people's salaries in a windfall situation is problematic.
You know, I'm so glad you talked about that earlier, because I feel your comment about sweat equity fueling the field is very true. I think it's unconscionable that every artist assumes that they'll never have full healthcare or buy a house or have the normal assurances that most everybody else has. I think for us in the field, it's important to step up and say, we need to challenge that notion, because at some point that leads to a breakdown of the system. And I think we can do better. And I think there was a bit of a moral obligation in this moment also to do that. It's our most precious resource, right? And so I'd love to have more conversations about that, actually, because that weighs on me like every day is how narrow the margins have been, and how much, while we have benefited from windfalls, many of the gig workers, the artists, the per diem workers have seen the other end of this. And I think that should weigh on all of our conscience, right?
Yep. And I think, I think one of the things we just did a survey with another cohort, and we asked leaders, what is the top couple things you're on your mind? And it was with a little over 29 organizations. Number one in the hit parade, pay transparency. How are we more transparent and more fair? Because it's something that they are living with as leaders every day and getting pushed really hard on. And as they do their equity work, they're getting pushed even harder on. So, yep.
Susan, Carrie Baldwin again, Desert Museum. Yeah, couple of things on that conversation that pop in. You know, we're coming from an ecological, environmental baseline rather than an arts culture.
Yes. Yep.
So I'm a biologist.
Yep. Yep.
By training. And two things come out. When we look at natural systems, a diverse natural system is a more sustainable and a stronger system.
Yep. So
business models we found, you know, working with industry are very, very similar.
Mm-hmm.
And the other one is, and to that point of how do we explain to our employees some of the elements? The other one is that natural systems that are sustainable and strong work at an optimal level, not a maximal level.
Yep.
So it's important to have our staff understand that we may have a windfall, but we can't maximize that windfall within the system except for a very short term. And generally, there are significant consequences to that.
That's right.
So I think, you know, having that connectivity of models across from an environmental to a human system is important for people to understand.
Yep. I agree.
And I would, this is Mary Price, also Desert Museum. I'd like to follow up on Carrie's remark, just to point out that the word economics and the word ecology have the same roots. And so ecology, the science of it, the natural systems that Carrie is talking about, is really the economics of the household.
Yep.
And it's the same for human organizations, households, any sort of human economy or organization. So thank you, Carrie, for pointing that out.
Yep. Yes, Kate, I've heard that same thing recently. Yep. If you can't pay everybody a living wage, you have a faulty business model. Yep. Okay, anything else that people want to talk about? You guys stuck in there for a 9 o'clock meeting talking about money.
I'd actually like to, I think Samantha started to touch on it earlier, but we find ourselves, windfall situation and, have our cash on hand looks great. Mm-hmm. And thankfully, who would have ever thought I would have said that 18 months ago? Jeez. But, as we're kind of rolling out of this, we're finishing our audit from last year. We're deciding what to, how to talk about where we are. We had some projects we wanted to start prior to COVID that got put on hold. And now we're kind of emerging back into working on those projects. And I'm, looking at, talking to donors. And I haven't been in this situation before where, my cash position looks great. And, I don't know if they're going to feel like, well, we know you got Piper money, so why don't you just use some of that Piper money? And I know the more sophisticated donors are not going to think that, and they're going to understand that this is a once in a lifetime, hopefully COVID's once in a lifetime kind of situation. But I do think that there's going to be donors out there that don't get it. I've already had one person, oh, didn't you get Piper money? I was like, oh, geez. So I just love, Susan, you or anyone to talk about that or thoughts.
So I would really be interested in what everybody else has experienced and what they do. I will say, I have worked with many institutions over the last 20 years who have gotten huge individual windfall gifts that are publicly known. Mrs. Gottrocks gave $10 million to this organization that you're working for. And I also would say, I think we've all talked about this, many of us already in different training situations. Even if you have a pretty decent balance sheet, sometimes people ask you, why do they need the money? You need the money, which, always like rocks my world. Like, really? You only want to give to bailouts? Really? And then you complain about they're not responsible. What? So I think one of the things we always say is talk about the outcome of what their investment pays for, rather than the organizational need. We need $150,000, but I need you to support the outcome that we're trying to chase. Is a very compelling way to get donors off because I agree with you, sophisticated donors won't ever say to you, you have this money. They'll get that money lets their money be more effective, right? So, if they gave you unrestricted money and it's paying for the electric bill, and they don't have to pay for the electric bill, right? But that's not what you're pitching. What you're pitching is the outcomes. And I think that's really what we're all selling, right? Is why is the world a better place in a very specific way? Because we're about to do this and you're going to invest in it with me. I think that's really what we've been seeing. But I would be interested in hearing other people talk about that.
Kate, I'll share with you that we had a couple of donor events with mostly our core donors shortly after the Piper Trust gift. And I'll say most of them said, I hope you're going to invest that wisely. That they get that we need to be strategic about that and that it's not going to fund operations. So again, to your point, the sophisticated, the loyal donors who we've been cultivating, communicating with, understand that these big gifts have to be used a certain way. Some of the smaller ones are not, but that's your hot money, like in banking anyway. It's churning all the time. Right. So fingers crossed that was what I heard was good, and everyone's thinking that way.
Yeah. Anyone else? If not, it was great to see you all. I wish I could see you all in person. I'd wait for that. I can't wait for we can do that again. We, TDC's, Rachel, I, and we're all here to help. I know that we've talked to you many times over the last chunk of time around your own capitalization structures. If you have a question, if you go back and look at your financials through this screen and you say, how did she calculate that thing with Erna? Call us, don't wonder. Or if you wanted us to take a look at your reserves and make sure we understand, we see what you see, we're happy to chat. Anything we can do to be helpful around that. Any questions, follow up where you think, happy to help you. Okay.
Great session. Thank you, Flinn Foundation, for doing this. This is outstanding.
It's good to see you all. Talk soon.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Enjoyed this. Thank you.
Thanks for being here, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.